The moral of the story?
Yeah.
Well,
Moral?
we'll have to read it before we figure out the moral, if there's a moral.
Oh, I thought it like one of the songs that had a moral of the story at the end. Like the boy and like the wolf and the wolf and his boy. He'd always
The horse and his boy?
boy who cried wolf.
Oh, the boy who cried wolf. These are not.
Isn't that?
Yeah, these aren't moralistic tales. It's kind of like fresh fiction. It's like about observances that people made of animals doing things and then wrote stories about kind of the animals kind of from like, if I was that animal, maybe how would I be thinking? So this.
Dad, there's something I have to tell you.
Okay.
Cinnamon.
Synonym.
Okay, can you read now?
Okay, I can read now. Okay, this is called Gotch Ear. The weathered butt of his 30-30 swung quick and snug to Zook Spar's shoulder. The hammer clicked back. With the sureness of long habit, the squint of his right eye caught the sights in line. Yet, quick as he was, the jump mule deer was quicker. One instant it stood there, fresh sprung from its startled bed, antlered head high, a narrow rift of sunlight glistening on the damp blackness of its nostrils. The next, in less than half the time space of a drawn breath, its graceful shape was only a swiftly vanishing patch of brownish gray shuttling across a lattice of dark tree trunks. Time was when Zook Spar, catching that moving flash of color ever so briefly in his sights, would have fired. But such a running shot in timber was likely to wound without killing. And Zook's aging legs no longer felt equal to the job of trailing down a wounded deer. Besides, the older he got, the worse he hated to cause wild creatures needless suffering. "Oh, quick, clean killer, nothing," was the way he expressed it to the ailing little old woman who was his wife. "But sure beat on their vitals. I just won't shoot if I don't have it." Badly as he wanted a buck, after a dozen leg-weary days of unsuccessful hunting, with only one more day of the legal season left, Zook thumbed the hammer down without firing. With a sigh that was part disappointment, part weariness, part the bone ache of age, he sat down on the dry hillside. And he got out his tobacco. This was the last season he'd be able to hunt, like as not. "Knocked over many a buck in my day," he grumbled to his pipe. "But if I don't do hurry pretty quick, I won't never knock over another. No, I reckon it doesn't matter." Just the same, the idea made him feel bad. "Getting stumble-footed, sure enough. I can't even stalk a spike in a whole season's hunting." But this deer had been no little spike. Even in that brief flash of hide and horn, Zook had recognized the buck as old Gotch Ear, wise and wary king of Columbine Cove. He remembered the first time he had seen this buck with the mutilated ear some years ago. He had seen him many times since. He even shot at him a time or two. The 3 or 4 mile circle of ridge, slope, and draw, of which Columbine Cove was the center, was Gotch Ear's home range. He never went far from it. Zook remembered that first encounter with a chuckle. He was riding down Zigzag Ridge with the golden glory of October aspens all around him, and 2 fresh-killed grouse in the slicker roll behind his saddle. Of course, it had been wrong for him to shoot grouse out of season, but his wife, home from the hospital after a long illness, had craved grouse meat to tempt her ailing appetite. So, despite the law, Zook had ridden far to an old burn on the main ridge to kill her one. The temptation to make it 2 had just been too much for him. He had just cut into the trail on Zigzag Ridge, homeward bound, when he saw the buck standing at the edge of a bunch grass park at the crest of the ridge's next bend. Head high, his antlers ragged with half-shed velvet, one big round ear cocked forward, the young buck stood looking at the man across the curving dip of the ridge. The other ear Zook saw was mutilated, a mere stump, from which hung a shapeless flap like a jingle bob. With no intention of shooting, Zook was thinking what a dilly of a chance it would make, when suddenly the buck swung his head around to look the other way. He stamped a foot, nervously, his front hoof pounding into the ground. Zook knew the signs. Somebody, or something, was coming westward up the ridge toward the buck. As the deer's tail went up, and he vanished with a long, swift jump into a thicket, slanting steeply down the north slope of the ridge, Zook quietly dismounted, took a gunny sack with the 2 grouse in it from inside his slicker roll, and hid it behind a clump of snowberry bushes a few yards off the trail. He stepped carefully so as to make neither noise nor tracks. Remounted, slicker rolled behind the saddle once more. Zook rode on. On the trail about where the young buck had stood, he met Forest Ranger Logan. Logan was new, and he took his duties as deputy game warden very seriously. "Mr. Spark," he said, "man could hide a grouse in his slicker roll, and I'd never know it unless I took a look." "Would you mind?" "Sure wouldn't," agreed Zook. He unlaced the slicker and tossed it to the ranger. "So maybe you better." The ranger shook it out, saw that it concealed nothing, and handed it back with the grunt. "Sorry," he said stiffly, "but I've been told some of you old settlers kill game out of season whenever you please. It's only fair to warn you. It'll go hard with anybody I catch." "Look me over in time you take a notion, mister," invited Zook. Nevertheless, that night, Ma Spar had the grouse meat she craved for supper. After giving the ranger plenty of time to get well out of sight and hearing, Zook had staked his pony in a small grassy park, and circled back through the timber out of sight of the trail and picked up his illegal game. "That got-cheered buck sure done me a favor, warning me somebody was coming," he chuckled to his wife as he fried tender white slices of young grouse breast to a crisp golden brown. "Well, I'd be in jail, like as not, if he hadn't." "You ought never to shoot that buck, Pa," said his wife. "You'll always know him by his gotch-ear, won't you, when you see him?" "Aw, baby. Shucks, you can't figure on treating animals like people. If I don't shoot him, Some other hunter will. How do you reckon he ever came to get his ear torn up that away? Ma Spar's sympathy for the buck persisted. No coyotes, like as not. He must have been right smart of a fighter, though, ever to get loose of them, once they got hold of him. Thus old Zook Spar had sworn off breaking the game laws, and thus Gotcheer, the buck, had stepped from the anonymity of most wild things to the status of name and personality. Without knowing it, his mutilated ear had labeled him with character. Zook had been right in guessing that Gotcheer was right smart of a fighter. He was only a 4-pointer when a lone, black-hackled mountain coyote had run him, tongue out and exhausted, all the way over from Columbine Cove to the feudal refuge of the shallow water of Beaver Creek. He had, nevertheless, put up a battle when the bloodthirsty coyote finally caught up with him. According to every rule of tooth and fang, the coyote should have been able to wear his enemy down and kill him, but instead of dodging about amongst the willows, thus exposing his tender flanks to the attack of slashing fangs, the young buck had backed his rump deep into the thorny protection of a wild gooseberry bush, and faced his enemy with hoof and horn. Few weapons are more deadly. As the coyote leapt to slash at the young buck's throat, the glancing strike of a hard, sharp hoof against his shoulder threw him far enough off balance that all his first vicious snap caught was a mouthful of hair. His next try fared a little better. This time the young buck met the assault with lowered horns. Agilely avoiding the thrust of those sharp points, the coyote's fangs managed to seize an ear. At hamstring, flank, or throat, the killer would have slashed and leapt back. But with only an ear hold, he hung on. More than once, he had dragged down a cornered doe by such a hold so that his companions could get in closer for a death slash. But this time he was alone, and this time it was no hornless doe he had tackled. As he swung himself sideways to twist the deer's neck and force him down, a prong of almost needle-sharp antler somehow snagged into the soft belly skin between his own shaggy flanks. With a quick toss of his antlers, the young buck flung the killer from him. When that coyote got up, some of his entrails were trailing out on the ground, and he did not attack again. Still winded from the long, hard run the coyote had given him, the young buck now staggered downstream to take refuge in the deeper water of a beaver pond half a mile away. Spattering red on the alder branches with every shake of his head. But though his whole head and neck seemed to be one bloody mess, their ear wound was not serious. In a couple of months it was completely healed, but a monstrosity in shape. A Gotch ear, marking him for life. Though doubtless Gotch ear did not know it, in the years that followed, his blemished ear several times saved him from a bullet, when hunters passed up shots at him because what they wanted was not mere venison, but an unblemished head to mount and hang on the wall. On the other hand, because Gotcheer was now a deer with a name, other hunters made special efforts to bag him. "Where are you aiming to hunt, Hank?" "Well, old Zook Spar claims that old Gotcheer's buck's wearing a 12-point rocking chair on his head this year. So I thought I might try the Columbine Cove country. Sure be mighty proud to bag that old bugger." There was some such talk in the hunting camps every season. Trouble is, another hunter would say, well, Zook tells me it's gotcha or nothing when you hunt the Columbine because he keeps every other buck bigger than a spike plumb run out of there. Even 2-3 weeks before the rutting season begins. Must be quite an old boy that got here. Yeah, I sure like to pack him in. But season followed season and nobody did. All that Gotchier knew about it, of course, was that whenever the hollowish slaps of rifle shots began to echo across the canyons early some chill frosty morn in November, it was time to be wise and wary by sticking close to the cover of thickets. Always it reminded him of the November when he had been a six-pointer, and from what he had considered a safe distance of 300 yards, an enemy with the thunder voice had reached out and knocked him down with a grazing shot across the top of his neck. The lesson of that wound had never been forgotten. Get out of sight and get there quick. Thus, living in a world of enemies, where the faintest unidentified scent or sound might mean lurking death, whether cougar, man, or wolf, Gotchier managed by luck and sagacity to survive to a healthy old age. Though he lived in fear, like all wild creatures whose flesh is good to eat, there was a proud, arrogant magnificence in the way he carried his head. For among his own kind, he was a master. Getting old or not, on the day Zook's spar jumped him so late in the season, Gotchier was still the king of Columbine Cove. Slacking off on his run from the hunter, Gotchier had turned down a steep slant to the next bench below, aiming to use its dense fir thicket as cover for circling back into Columbine Cove when the strong, musky scent of a strange buck assailed his nostrils. Abruptly he halted. With the season of the rut approaching, already his neck had begun to swell, tanging his blood with strange yet familiar urgencies. Like hackles on a dog, the hair now rose a little on his neck. Militantly he stamped a front hoof. Picking up the strange buck's track, he snuffed it. Audibly. Enemies. His world was full of them. But this was the scent of an enemy to be challenged and fought, not run away from. Every year it happened. Some big, black, brisketed buck from the high country turned up in his territory. Sometimes 2 or 3 of them in succession. And every year, Gotchier challenged them, fought them, whipped them, and drove them off before they ever got a chance to take up with the does of Columbine Cove. Well, let 'em come, the surly arrogance of his manner seemed to say. I've whipped 'em before, and I can do it again. There's fight in the old boy yet. To prove it, he paused every now and then on his slow trailing of the intruder to thrash the devil out of a clump of jimbush or balsam sapling. With every such encounter, the old buck's wrath increased, yet never enough to relax his cautious lookout for hunters. Warily, he kept to the thickest of the thickets. If an opening no more than 20 feet wide lay across his course, he detoured, half a mile if necessary, to avoid crossing it. Even when thrashing out a willow, he paused every second or two to listen for any sound that might mean lurking danger. Invisibility, he had learned, meant safety. So regardless of where the intruding buck's track might lead, until the thick black cover of night was upon the woods, Gotchier kept strictly under cover. Thus, with the necessity of some time out for feeding, it was well on toward the dawn the next morning when finally he overtook the buck, whose intrusion had so stirred his wrath. It had clouded up about dusk the evening before, snowed a few inches in the night, and now cleared again, with only starlight and a thin wedge of white moon to lighten the somberness of dark-timbered mountains. But the mule deer's eyes are made to see with in such dim light. At Gotch-Ear's stiff-legged approach, the intruder raised the broad spread of his 10-point antlers and stared at him, unconcernedly at first, for the belligerence of the rutting season was not yet strong in him. But when Gotch-Ear began circling, with bowed head, lowered neck, the black brisketed buck promptly accepted the challenge. The clack of horn against horn awoke a sleeping squirrel in a nearby spruce, sent him scolding to a higher limb. Having maneuvered for the downhill push, Gotch-Ear won out handily in that first abrupt clash, backing the intruder rapidly down the hill, until, with a sudden windy snuff, he broke away, sprang free, dodged behind a willow clump, leapt high over a log fall, and trotted nonchalantly off a few yards to resume feeding on the twigs of wild huckleberry, lacing up through the shallow snow. He seemed at the moment much more interested in feeding than in fighting. Gotch-Ear's prompt leap over the log fall in pursuit was, so he thought, charged with all the old strength and vigor that had made him king of Columbine Cove all these years. But the age in his legs betrayed him. Failing to clear Hey guys.
Sorry, Dad. Andy's butt said bye-bye.
Did Andy's booty hang up on me?
Yep.
Bye-bye, booty. Alright, pirate booty. Where were we? Oh, here we go. Having maneuvered for the downhill push, Gotch-Ear won out handily in that first abrupt clash, backing the intruder rapidly down the hill until, with a sudden windy snuff, he broke away, sprang free, dodged behind a willow clump, leapt high over a log fall, and trotted nonchalantly off a few yards to resume feeding on the twigs of wild huckleberry, lacing up through the shallow snow. He seemed at the moment much more interested in feeding than in fighting. Gotch-Ear's prompt leap over the log fall in pursuit was, so he thought, charged with all the old strength and vigor that had made him king of Columbine Cove all these years. But the age in his legs betrayed him. Failing to clear the last log of the fall, he almost took a tumble, neck outstretched, knees plowing the earth. It was the other buck's chance to get him while he was down. But bucks don't fight that way. Besides, Gotch-Ear's crash was too much like the tumble of a shot buck, which the black brisket had witnessed only a week ago on Spring Mountain. Now he snorted spookily and pulled out. When he had thrashed another bush or two, to reassure himself that he was still full of the old spizzerinctum, Gotchier followed. This time when they clashed, the invader began to get his dander up. It was Gotchier who gave ground. Finally, breaking free of the headlock, he leapt desperately sideways to avoid the thrust of the other buck's antlers in his flank as he turned. Yet plainly he did not consider himself defeated. It was broad daylight now, and the occasional echo of a distant shot reminded both bucks that their other enemies, the hunters, were still abroad. Once out of the younger buck's reach, Gotchier stopped, head high, his good ear alert, sniffing and listening. The barest hint of man scent on the wind made him vaguely uneasy. On magically silent hooves, he circled the aspen glade and headed deep into one of Columbine Cove's tightest thickets. There, in the midst of a log fall, he circled back where he could watch his own track and bedded down. From the spot he chose, he could see a few yards downwind, but remained well hidden from the rear, from his blind direction. He counted on windborne scent for warning of any approaching danger. Thus warily placed, he should be fairly safe from the average hunter. It was from such a bed that old Zook Spar had jumped him the day before. But this time, old Zook had the advantage of fresh snow to muffle his footsteps and for tracking. At the very moment when Gotchier heaved his windy, bedded down sigh and belched his first cud, old Zook, half a mile away downwind, was studying tracks where the two bucks had sparred their first round. Within 5 minutes, Gotchier was up again, and it was neither scent nor sound of hunter that had disturbed him. From a similar day bed 200 or 300 yards to the westward, the breeze brought a persistent buck musk scent that told him the intruder was still in his domain and making himself at home. It was more than the old king's pride could stand. Hunter danger half forgotten, he quit his bed and struck out westward to renew the battle. The black, brisketed biggin from the high country, it appeared, was willing to oblige. That was still fairly early in the morning. By noon, the two bucks had almost completely circled Columbine Cove. Every quarter mile or so along their trail, a patch of hoof-plowed snow slush, ripped tufts of hair and small spatters of blood showed where they had locked horns, fought a while, then moved on, soon to fight again. By mid-afternoon, it was no longer the tentative sparring of two bucks, in whom the seasonal wrath of the rutting season was just coming to life. Now the track showed plainly the battle had become a grim and deadly one. The aging king of Columbine Cove was fighting desperately for the mastery of the domain he had so long considered his own, and the bold, full-muscled younger intruder, gaining in arrogance with every clash, showed plainly that he had no intention of being chased away. Once lithe muscles in Gotchir's body ached with tiredness. From shanky hips, once broad and powerful, driblets of blood oozed from the gouge of antler points whose thrust he had not been quite agile enough to avoid. But never had he retreated far, only far enough to maneuver for another clash. For his was a warrior's heart, and a proud one, born to win or to go down fighting. Under the lengthening shadows of late afternoon, on a ridge flank at the western rim of Columbine Cove, Gotch...
Dad,
Yeah,
we have 15 minutes.
15 more minutes?
Yep.
Okay. We only got about 3 more pages.
Okay. Okay, now. I muted it.
Okay.
Muted it.
Once lithe muscles in Gotchir's body ached with tiredness. From shanky hips, once broad and powerful, driblets of blood oozed from the gouge of antler points whose thrust he had not been quite agile enough to avoid. But never had he retreated far, only far enough to maneuver for another clash, for his was a warrior's heart, and a proud one, born to win or to go down fighting. Under the lengthening shadows of late afternoon, on a ridge flank at the western rim of Columbine Cove, Gotchir maneuvered once more for the advantage of a downhill push. His blood-smeared neck was bowed, his tongue out, and something of the weariness of his body had at last reached his heart. Not fear, but a vague, aching dread, as if some ancient instinct told him that to lock horns with this tireless enemy again meant that his day as a monarch was done. With a clacking, almost metallic crash, the hard antlers of the 2 circling bucks swung, clashed, and locked together. Arrogantly, as if he no longer felt the need of any such advantage for himself, the black brisketed buck let Gotchir have the uphill position. Then, slowly, the power of his younger muscles forced the old deer back. Slowly, but surely, sidling him around the slant of the hill and losing him his original advantage. Leg weary, plumb wore out from his long day of trailing the 2 fighting bucks, old Zook's spar heard their windy grunting as they strained against each other even before he came in sight. Then, through a brief break in the tangle of timber that lay between him and the deer, he caught sight of one of them, just going down to his knees. Most any other time, Zook would have wanted to watch the fight. But now this was almost the last hour of the last day of what might be his last season of deer hunting. Grimly, he had kept on hunting, determined this last day to bag a buck. Quickly he raised his rifle and leveled down for a bead on the half-fallen buck. But, like Gotchir, Zook too was getting old, and old eyes after a day of bright sun and new snow will water. In the instant he paused to wipe his sighting eye with a gnarled knuckle, the half-fallen buck leapt free, and Zook saw that it was Gotchir. The other buck lunged, then intervening brush hid them a moment. The hunter heard a bleat of pain. Then, in a moment, through a rift in the bush, there was Gotchir meeting the other buck's charge, head on again. "Dang it, I better be getting me a buck," Zook told himself, while the getting's good. The weathered butt of his 30-30 swung snug to his shoulder. The hammer clicked back. The squint of his right eye lined the sights on a spot just back on the shoulder, on the only one of the fighting bucks he could see plainly enough for a dead sure shot. At this moment, Gotch ear, wholly unaware of the gun sights lined on his vitals, went down to one knee again. Lost ground. This, he knew, was it. The end. The king of Columbine Cove was whipped. Yet, for just one more futile, desperate try, he gathered the strength of his failing muscles. Even 100 yards away, old Zook Spar turned to the feel of the wilderness, suddenly sensed the magnificence of the buck's effort. At the risk of getting no shot at all, he abruptly lowered his rifle, shifted to a new position, raised the gun again, found dark deer hide in the sights, and pulled the trigger. To Gotchir's tremendous surprise, the black brisketed buck suddenly went down before his last desperate shove. Freeing his antlers with a triumphant yank, Gotchir stood for a brief instant staring down at the limp, kicking body of his strangely defeated enemy. Then from across far canyons came back echoes to remind him of the shot, whose sound he had heard, but hardly realized in the tenseness of his final moment of battle. "Wish you could have seen the way he throwed up his head before he had taken out," Zook Spar told his wife that night with a grin. "Yes, sir. Bloody but unbowed. And snort, not a snooky, spooky snort like they sometimes make. No, sir. Sound more like some old king's trumpet." "Well, I'm glad you shot the other one," said Ma Spar. "You sorta owed Gotch your favor, remember?" "This and I kill will be tender meat anyway," said old Zook, as if that's why he had done it. "I expect old Gotch's purty tough." But up in the night shadowed solitude of Columbine Cove, Gotchir, stiff and sore, didn't try to figure it out. Enough for him that the black brisketed invader from Spring Mountain no longer menaced the realm of an aging, but still undaunted, king of the Cove.